She was laughed at for believing her grandmother's stories about hidden Civil War secrets. But when they opened the basement vault, every historian in the room went silent. It was a dismissal that echoed with condescension, a moment designed to crush the dreams of a desperate woman clinging to fairy tales. Yet, in the quiet determination of one single mother, it only sparked a deeper, more unsettling curiosity. What secret could an old mansion's basement possibly hold that would cause respected academics, accustomed to dusty archives and ancient artifacts, to freeze in stunned disbelief? The prevailing assumptions about delusion versus historical truth were about to be utterly shattered, revealing a past so extraordinary it defied every textbook, hidden beneath layers of Victorian wallpaper and decades of neglect. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The mockery hung heavy in the autumn air of Millbrook, Virginia, stirring an immediate, emotional response of indignation and a pressing question in the minds of anyone who witnessed it. What could possibly be so special about this crumbling old house? Here was an unusual element. A seemingly desperate woman, capable of silencing distinguished professors, tapping into a primal fear of dismissing something truly groundbreaking. It was a psychological hook, the stark contrast between her humble circumstances and the profound historical reality about to be unveiled. The whispers still rang in the ears of the bewildered townspeople. "She's lost her mind, living in fantasies," they muttered behind cupped hands at the local diner. The tension was compressed, a historical mystery building, promising a revelation that would shift the very foundations of their understanding of American Civil War intelligence operations. Then a chilling discovery cut through the stunned silence of the academic community, barely believable, but laden with an inexplicable significance that would rewrite history books. "Wait, these documents, they can't be authentic," Professor Williams had whispered, his voice trembling as he examined the weathered papers with trembling hands. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications, a recognition dawning on the Historical Society members who had gathered to debunk what they assumed were the ravings of a grief-stricken woman. A chilling inquiry that would soon be posed to the entire historical community. How did she know? Becca Martinez had inherited more than just a house when her grandmother, Elena, passed away that gray October morning. She had inherited a burden, a mystery wrapped in peeling paint and creaking floorboards. And most importantly, she had inherited a story that everyone insisted was nothing more than an old woman's confused memories. But Becca knew better. As a veteran of 3 tours in Afghanistan, she understood the weight of secrets, the way truth could hide in plain sight. Disguised as folklore and dismissed as fantasy, the Thornfield Manor stood like a monument to decay. On the outskirts of Millbrook, its Gothic revival architecture casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds that hadn't seen proper maintenance since the 1970s. The mansion's imposing facade, with its pointed arches and elaborate stonework, had been the subject of local ghost stories for decades. Children dared each other to run past it on Halloween night, convinced that the empty windows were watching them with malevolent intent. What they didn't know was that those windows had indeed been watching, observing, and protecting secrets for over a century and a half. Becca stood on the front porch that first day, her 7-year-old daughter Sophie clinging to her jacket, both of them staring at the enormous oak door with its tarnished brass knocker shaped like a raven. The house seemed to loom over them, all 3 stories of Victorian excess and architectural ambition that had been Elena's prison and sanctuary for the last 40 years of her life. The will had been simple. Everything goes to Rebecca, the only granddaughter who had ever listened to the stories, the only one who had ever believed. "Mommy, it looks scary," Sophie whispered, her dark eyes wide as she took in the gargoyles perched on the corner eaves and the ivy that had claimed most of the eastern wall. Becca squeezed her daughter's hand, remembering her own first visit to This place when she was Sophie's age. How Grandma Elena had told her stories about brave men and women who had used this house to change the course of American history. Back then, it had seemed like the most magical place in the world. Now, as a 32-year-old single mother facing an uncertain financial future, it felt more like a responsibility she wasn't sure she could handle. The inheritance had come at a time when Becca desperately needed a miracle. Her transition out of the army had been rougher than expected, with PTSD making it difficult to hold down steady employment and Sophie's medical bills from her asthma treatments eating away at their savings. The small apartment they'd been renting in Richmond was barely affordable, and the notice from the landlord about the rent increase had arrived the same week as Elena's death. It was as if the universe had conspired to force her into this moment, standing before a house that everyone said was worthless, holding keys that might unlock either salvation or ruin. Becca Martinez had been a fixture in Millbrook for decades. The eccentric old woman who spoke with a slight accent that nobody could quite place, and who insisted on wearing vintage dresses that looked like they belonged in a 1940s movie. She had moved to the town in 1978, purchased the abandoned Thornfield Manor for what locals considered an impossibly high price, and then proceeded to live there alone, emerging only for groceries and the occasional visit to the library's historical section. She spoke to very few people, but those who had conversations with her came away with strange stories about her knowledge of Civil War history that seemed impossibly detailed and personal. The townspeople had theories. Of course, some said she was a retired college professor who had lost her mind after retiring. Others whispered that she was related to some important historical family and was living off old money. The more unkind speculation suggested she was simply a lonely woman who had read too many romance novels and convinced herself she was living in one. But Elena had never tried to convince anyone of anything. She simply lived her life, tended her gardens, and told stories to the one granddaughter who would listen. Becca remembered those stories, now as she turned to the key in the lock and heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. Stories about her great-grandmother Isabella, who had supposedly been a Confederate spy turned Union double agent. Stories about secret messages hidden in wallpaper patterns and coded letters disguised as love poems. Stories about a network of agents who had operated out of this very house, using its strategic location and Elena's ancestors' social connections to gather intelligence that had allegedly influenced major Civil War battles. Just stories, Becca's mother had always said dismissively. Mama Elena reads too many books and watches too many old movies. You shouldn't encourage her fantasies, Rebecca. But Becca had been drawn to those stories, especially during her teenage years when she was struggling to figure out who she was and where she belonged. There was something about Elena's certainty, the way she could describe events as if she had witnessed them herself, that made the stories feel more real than the mundane reality of high school and small-town expectations. The door swung open, with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms beyond. The interior was a time capsule, preserved exactly as Elena had left it, which meant it looked exactly as it had when Becca was a child visiting during summer vacations. The furniture was draped in white sheets, but underneath, she knew, were pieces that belonged in a museum. Victorian settees with carved wooden frames, Persian rugs that had somehow survived decades without fading, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch visitors with knowing eyes. Sophie's grip on her hand loosened as they stepped into the foyer, her natural curiosity overcoming her initial fear. The entrance hall soared 2 stories high, with a chandelier that caught what little afternoon light managed to penetrate their heavy curtains. A grand staircase swept upward, its mahogany banister polished to a deep shine that reflected their movements like a dark mirror. Everything was exactly as Becca remembered it, down to the faint scent of lavender and old books that seemed to permeate every room. "Can we explore, Mommy?" Sophie asked, her voice small in the vast space, but filled with the kind of excitement that only children can summon when faced with a real-life adventure. Becca nodded, though she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay before them. This wasn't just a house. It was a responsibility, a piece of history that Elena had entrusted to her care. But it was also their only option for stable housing. Assuming the place was actually habitable, they spent the first hour just walking through the main floor, opening curtains and letting light flood into rooms that had been dark for too long. The parlor still held Elena's collection of Civil War memorabilia, display cases filled with bullets and buttons and photographs of soldiers who looked impossibly young in their uniforms. The library was exactly as Becca remembered. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books on American history, military strategy, and biographical accounts of people whose names were footnotes in textbooks, but who had apparently been central figures. In Elena's version of events, the kitchen had been modernized sometime in the 1950s, with appliances that were ancient by today's standards, but which appeared to be in working order. Elena had always been practical, maintaining the house's essential systems, even as she let the exterior deteriorate. The dining room table could seat 12 people, and Becca remembered Elena explaining that it had been designed for entertaining. Back when the house had been the center of local society rather than its mysterious outskirt. It was in the study that Becca first noticed something unusual. Elena's desk was cleared, except for a single envelope with Becca's name written in her grandmother's careful script. Inside was a letter, brief but cryptic. Rebecca, the truth is in the foundation. Look for Isabella's star where the shadows point downward. The key is in the music box, the one that plays Battle Hymn of the Republic. Trust no one until you know everything. Love, Abuela. The music box was easy to find. It had been sitting on Elena's dresser for as long as Becca could remember, a delicate wooden box with intricate carving that played the familiar melody when its lid was lifted. But she had never noticed that the bottom of the box had a hidden compartment, revealed only when she pressed on a specific corner of the carved design. Inside was an old-fashioned key, ornate and heavy, with a tag that simply read, Foundation. Sophie had grown tired of the exploration by then, curling up on one of the sheet-covered sofas with a book she'd found in the children's section of the library. Becca left her daughter reading and made her way to the basement, following Elena's cryptic instructions about shadows pointing downward. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, leading to a stone-walled cellar that felt significantly older than the house above it. The foundation walls were thick fieldstone, the kind of construction that suggested this basement had been built to last centuries rather than decades. The shadows Elena had mentioned were cast by the small window set high in the walls, and following their direction led Becca to a section of the foundation that looked slightly different from the rest. The stones were arranged in a pattern that formed the five-pointed star, so subtle that it would be invisible unless someone knew exactly what to look for. At the center of the star pattern was a small hole, perfectly sized for the key she held in her hand. What Becca discovered when she turned that key would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her inheritance, and the quiet town of Millbrook, Virginia. But in that moment, standing in the dim basement with dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, she was simply a single mother trying to make sense of her grandmother's final gift, unaware that she was about to unlock one of the most significant historical discoveries of the 21st century. The town of Millbrook, Virginia had been built around secrets, though most of its 3,400 residents had long forgotten that fact. Nestled in the rolling hills between Richmond and Charlottesville, it appeared to be nothing more than a sleepy southern community where the biggest excitement came from Friday night high school football games and the annual Civil War reenactment that drew tourists every October. The downtown consisted of a single main street lined with antique shops, a diner that had been serving the same menu since 1962, and a historical society housed in a converted train depot that displayed faded photographs and rusted artifacts. With hand-typed labels that nobody bothered to read anymore, but Millbrook's location had made it strategically important during the Civil War, positioned as it was along a crucial supply route between the Confederate capital and the Shenandoah Valley. What the history books didn't mention, and what even the local historical society had forgotten, was that the town had been home to one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks of the entire conflict. The Thornfield Manor, with its commanding view of the surrounding countryside and its proximity to both railroad lines and telegraph wires, had been perfectly positioned to serve as a center of operations for activities that officially had never existed. Becca Martinez understood hierarchies and command structures from her years in the military, but civilian life operated by different rules that she was still learning to navigate. In Millbrook, social standing was determined by family history, property ownership, and length of residence, factors that left her and Sophie occupying an uncertain position in the community's carefully maintained order. They were simultaneously insiders and outsiders, connected to the town through Elena's decades of residence, but marked as different by Becca's military background, her single motherhood, and her Hispanic surname in a community that remained overwhelmingly white and conservative. The Martinez family had actually been in Virginia longer than most of the families who considered themselves founding members of Millbrook society, but that history had been deliberately obscured, buried beneath layers of official records and unofficial silence. Elena had arrived in 1978 as a widow with mysterious means, purchasing the abandoned Thornfield Manor from a estate sale and paying cash for renovations that transformed the crumbling Victorian into a livable home. She had never volunteered information about her background, and the few times anyone had asked direct questions, she had deflected with charm and vague references to family money from her late husband's side. The townspeople had created their own mythology around Elena Martinez over the decades. She was simultaneously respected for her obvious education and refinement, feared for her reclusiveness and foreign accent, and pitied for her apparent loneliness and obsession with Civil War history. The local ladies' auxiliary had tried to include her in their activities during her first years in town, but Elena had politely declined most invitations, attending only the events that related to historical preservation or education. She had donated generously to the library and the Historical Society, but always anonymously, leaving the recipients to speculate about the source of the contributions. Dr. Margaret Whitmore had been the director of the Millbrook Historical Society for 15 years, and she embodied everything that Elena Martinez had quietly rebelled against during her time in town. Dr. Whitmore was a seventh-generation Millbrook resident whose family had owned the largest plantation in the county before the Civil War, and she approached local history with the kind of proprietary attitude that came from believing her ancestors had written the story, rather than simply lived through it. She was a formidable woman in her early 60s, with steel gray hair that she wore in a style that hadn't changed since the 1980s, and a manner of speaking that suggested she was perpetually addressing children who weren't paying sufficient attention. Antagonistic relationship between Dr. Whitmore and Elena had been one of Millbrook's most enduring forms of entertainment, though most residents didn't understand the deeper currents that drove their conflict. To outsiders, it appeared to be nothing more than a personality clash between two strong-willed women with different approaches to historical research. Dr. Whitmore believed in official documentation, published sources, and institutional authority, while Elena seemed to rely on family stories, intuition, and sources that she never revealed. Their disagreements at historical society meetings had become legendary, with Elena calmly presenting theories that challenged accepted narratives while Dr. Whitmore responded with increasingly frustrated citations of academic orthodoxy. The conflict had reached its peak 3 years earlier during a heated exchange about the role of women in Civil War intelligence operations. Elena had suggested that the Historical Society's exhibits understated the sophistication and importance of female operatives, particularly those who had worked in Virginia. Dr. Whitmore had dismissed the idea as romantic fantasy, insisting that serious historians relied on documented evidence rather than wishful thinking about empowered women in a male-dominated era. Elena had responded by offering to provide documentation that would prove her point, but when Dr. Whitmore had demanded to see this evidence immediately, Elena had simply smiled and said that some truths took time to reveal themselves properly. The exchange had effectively ended Elena's participation in the Historical Society's activities, though she had continued her anonymous donations and her private research. Dr. Whitmore had declared victory in academic circles, using the incident as an example of how amateur historians could derail serious scholarship with unfounded speculation. But Elena's absence from meetings had left a noticeable void, and several members had privately admitted that her insights, however unconventional, had often proved remarkably accurate when they took the time to investigate her suggestions. Mayor Robert Bobby Carlyle represented the town's political establishment, a third-generation politician whose family had controlled local government for decades through a combination of genuine service and strategic alliance building. He was a practical man who understood that Millbrook's economic survival depended on balancing historical preservation with modern development, a task that required constant negotiation between competing interests. The Civil War tourism brought in revenue, but not enough to sustain the town's aging infrastructure, and the historical restrictions on downtown development made it difficult to attract new businesses. Bobby had always maintained a cordial relationship with Becca Martinez, partly because she had never caused problems that required his intervention, and partly because he suspected she had more influence than she chose to exercise. There had been rumors over the years about her connections to state historical preservation boards and federal grant committees, rumors that Bobby had never been able to confirm, but which had made him cautious about dismissing her concerns. Elena had occasionally contacted his office about maintenance issues affecting the historical district or concerns about proposed developments. Her suggestions had invariably proved sound, and her information had often been more accurate than what he received through official channels. The news of Elena's death had reached Bobby through the usual small-town channels, and he had made the expected expressions of sympathy while privately wondering what would happen to the Thornfield Manor. The house was one of Millbrook's most significant historical properties, but it was also a maintenance nightmare that required constant attention and considerable financial resources. Bobby had assumed that Elena's heirs would sell the property to developers, despite the historical restrictions that limited what could be done with it. The idea that her granddaughter might actually move into the house had been unexpected, and it raised questions about the family's financial situation and long-term plans that Bobby wasn't sure how to address. Rebecca's arrival in town with her young daughter had created a ripple of curiosity that Bobby was still trying to assess. Military veterans were generally well regarded in Millbrook, and the community had a history of supporting families dealing with the challenges of post-service adjustment. But Rebecca's situation was complicated by her connection to Elena, her obvious financial struggles, and the questions that surrounded the Thornfield Manor's future. Bobby had received several calls from concerned citizens who worried about the property's condition and its impact on neighborhood values, but he had also heard from others who were interested in helping the new family settle into the community. Millbrook Diner served as the town's unofficial information exchange, and it was there that Rebecca first encountered the full weight of local opinion about her inheritance and her prospects. Dolores Washington had been running the diner for 23 years, and she possessed the kind of encyclopedic knowledge of local affairs that made her both invaluable and potentially dangerous to anyone trying to maintain privacy. She was a kind woman who genuinely cared about her community, but she also understood that information was currency and that her position behind the counter gave her access to conversations and observations that others missed. That poor girl has no idea what she's gotten herself into, Dolores had confided to her morning regulars the day after. Rebecca and Sophie had been seen carrying boxes into the Thornfield Manor. Elena Martinez was a sweet lady, but that house is going to eat up whatever money that family has, and then some. Those old Victorians are beautiful, but they're money pits, especially ones that have been sitting empty for months. The regulars had nodded in agreement, though their motivations for concern varied considerably. Some were genuinely worried about a single mother and her child taking on such an overwhelming responsibility. Others were more interested in the potential impact on property values if the Thornfield Manor continued to deteriorate. A few saw opportunity in Rebecca's situation, anticipating that financial pressure would eventually force her to sell the house and its contents, possibly at prices that would benefit local collectors and antique dealers. Dr. Whitmore had been notably silent during these discussions, though her presence at the diner during Rebecca's first week in town had been conspicuous. She typically avoided the morning coffee crowd, preferring to take her meals at the country club or in her own home. But she had appeared at the diner 3 times during Rebecca's first week, always with historical society paperwork that required her attention, always positioned where she could observe the conversations around her without appearing to eavesdrop. The tension between Dr. Whitmore and Elena Martinez had been well known, but most people had assumed it would end with Elena's death. The possibility that it might continue through Elena's granddaughter had not occurred to anyone, including Dr. Whitmore herself. But Rebecca's military bearing and quiet confidence reminded several longtime residents of Elena's younger years, before grief and isolation had made her more withdrawn. There was something in the way Rebecca carried herself, a sense of purpose and hidden knowledge that suggested she might not be as vulnerable as her circumstances indicated. Rebecca herself was largely unaware of these undercurrents during her first days in Millbrook. She was focused on the immediate challenges of making the Thornfield Manor habitable for herself and Sophie, a task that required her to prioritize practical concerns over social dynamics. The house's electrical system needed updating, the plumbing required attention, and several rooms showed evidence of roof leaks that needed repair before the next storm. These were problems that could be solved with time, effort, and careful budgeting. Assuming she could find reliable contractors willing to work on a historic property with limited immediate payment. But Elena's cryptic letter and the mysterious key had introduced an element of uncertainty that Rebecca couldn't ignore. Her grandmother had never been given to dramatic gestures or meaningless mysteries, and the specific instructions about looking for Isabella's star suggested knowledge that Elena had been saving for this moment. The fact that Elena had hidden the key in the music box that had been visible on her dresser for decades indicated planning and patience that went far beyond casual preparation for her death. That Sophie had adapted to the move with the resilience that children often display when faced with major changes in their circumstances. The Thornfield Manor was an adventure to her, full of rooms to explore and stories to discover. And she had claimed a bedroom on the 2nd floor that overlooked the gardens and the distant hills. She had started school at Millbrook Elementary, where her teacher had reported that she was bright, well-behaved, and eager to make friends, though she occasionally told stories about her new house that sounded more like fairy tales than reality. Key that Elena had hidden felt heavy in Rebecca's hand as she stood in the basement, facing the stone wall with its subtle star pattern. She had spent 2 days researching the house's history at the library, reading through property records and newspaper archives that revealed surprisingly little about the mansion's past. The Thornfield Manor had been built in 1847 by a family named Ashworth, who had owned it until 1863, when it had been sold under circumstances that the records didn't explain. For the next century, it had changed hands multiple times, often remaining empty for years between owners, until Elena had purchased it in 1978 and ended its pattern of abandonment. But Elena's letter had mentioned Isabella, a name that didn't appear in any of the official records Rebecca had found. The reference to looking for shadows that pointed downward had led her to the basement, But it was her military training and observation and pattern recognition that had helped her identify the star formation in the stonework. Standing there with the key in her hand, Rebecca realized that she was about to cross a threshold that Elena had spent 40 years preparing her to cross. Though she still didn't understand what lay on the other side, the key turned with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been maintained and tested regularly despite its hidden location. Rebecca heard a soft click, followed by the grinding sound of stone against stone as a section of the foundation wall swung inward on concealed hinges. The opening revealed a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness, with stone steps leading downward into what appeared to be a natural cave system that extended far beyond the manor's foundation. Cool air flowed up from the depths, carrying the scent of earth and something else she couldn't identify, something that reminded her of old paper and preserved leather. Rebecca's first instinct was caution, a response trained into her by years of military service in environments where hidden spaces often concealed dangers. She retrieved a flashlight from the basement workbench and called up to Sophie, who was still absorbed in her book upstairs, telling her to stay in the parlor and not to worry if she heard strange noises. The passage was wide enough for one person to walk comfortably, with walls that showed evidence of careful construction rather than natural formation. Someone had spent considerable time and effort creating this hidden route, reinforcing the ceiling with wooden beams and installing drainage systems that had kept the space dry for decades. The stairs descended much farther than Rebecca had expected, leading to a chamber that extended well beyond the boundaries of the house above. Her flashlight beam revealed a space that was part natural cave and part constructed room, with carved stone walls that bore symbols and markings she didn't recognize. The chamber was furnished with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, heavy wooden tables and chairs that showed the wear of regular use but had been preserved by the stable temperature and humidity of the underground environment. Document cases lined the walls, their brass fittings green with age but their contents protected by wax seals that appeared to be intact. But it was the wall at the far end of the chamber that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. The entire surface was covered with maps, not modern reproductions, but original hand-drawn charts that showed the Virginia countryside in extraordinary detail. Railroad lines, telegraph routes, and military installations were marked with symbols that suggested intimate knowledge of Confederate and Union operations. Troop movements were tracked with colored pins and string, creating a visual representation of intelligence gathering that would have been invaluable to either side in the conflict. This wasn't the work of an amateur historian or a casual collector. This was evidence of a sophisticated operation that had continued long after the war's official end. Rebecca approached the document cases with the reverence she might have shown in a museum, understanding that she was looking at materials that could rewrite significant portions of Civil War history. The cases were labeled with dates ranging from 1861 to 1867, suggesting that whatever operation had been conducted from this location had continued well into the Reconstruction period. Inside the first case she opened, she found correspondence, written in multiple hands, some in English and others in Spanish, with a few documents that appeared to be in code. The paper was yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved, protected by the climate-controlled environment and Elena's careful maintenance. One letter, written in a feminine hand on expensive stationery, caught her attention immediately. It was addressed to "My dearest Thomas" and dated March 15, 1863, but its content was anything but romantic. The writer discussed troop positions around Richmond, supply shortages affecting Confederate forces, and plans for a spring offensive that she had learned about from our friend in Jefferson Circle. The letter was signed "Your devoted Isabella," and reading it, Rebecca realized she had found evidence of her great-great-grandmother's activities during the war. But Isabella's role was far more complex than Elena's stories had suggested. Correspondence revealed that Isabella Vasquez had been operating as a double agent, providing information to both Confederate and Union forces while pursuing her own agenda that seemed focused on protecting civilian populations and hastening the war's end. Her letters to Confederate contacts portrayed her as a loyal Southern sympathizer with access to Union intelligence, while her communications with Northern operatives presented her as a reformed rebel who had seen the error of Confederate ideology. But her private journals, written in Spanish and hidden among the other documents, told a different story entirely. Isabella had been born in California to a wealthy Spanish family, educated in Europe, and married to a Virginia planter who had died early in the war. Rather than retreating to safety as a wealthy widow, she had chosen to use her resources and social connections to minimize the conflict's impact on the community she had come to love. Her intelligence work had been motivated not by political loyalty to either side, but by a humanitarian desire to prevent unnecessary casualties and protect vulnerable populations from the war's worst excesses. She had used the Thornfield Manor as a center of operations, employing its hidden chambers and strategic location to coordinate activities that had influenced several major battles. The evidence of Isabella's network was staggering in its scope and sophistication. Rebecca found detailed profiles of dozens of operatives, from plantation wives who passed information through social correspondence to escaped slaves who carried messages along the Underground Railroad routes. The network had included Union officers who leaked Confederate plans, Confederate officials who revealed Northern strategies, and neutral parties who served as go-betweens when direct communication was impossible. Isabella had coordinated these activities from the Thornfield Manor, using its hidden chambers to store intelligence and its social functions to facilitate meetings between operatives who couldn't safely be seen together in public. But the most shocking discovery was evidence that Isabella's network had continued operating long after the war's official end, working to prevent reprisals against former Confederate officials and protect freed slaves from Ku Klux Klan violence. The documents showed that she had used her intelligence contacts to anticipate and prevent numerous incidents of post-war violence, working with both Union occupation forces and reformed Confederate leaders to maintain stability during the volatile Reconstruction period. Her efforts had saved hundreds of lives and prevented several incidents that could have reignited armed conflict in Virginia. Rebecca found herself spending hours in the hidden chamber, reading through documents that revealed not only Isabella's activities but the complex network of relationships and motivations that had driven Civil War intelligence operations. The official histories she had studied in school had presented the conflict as a straightforward struggle between opposing ideologies, but these documents revealed a much more nuanced reality. Loyalty and betrayal were fluid concepts, with operatives on both sides working toward goals that transcended simple military victory. Many of the individuals involved had been motivated by personal relationships, humanitarian concerns, or practical considerations that had little to do with the political rhetoric that dominated public discourse. The technical aspects of the intelligence operation were equally impressive. Isabella and her associates had developed sophisticated codes based on literary references and musical compositions, communication systems that used everything from flower arrangements to quilt patterns to convey information, and security protocols that had prevented the network's discovery despite operating for nearly a decade. The chamber contained codebooks, invisible ink formulations, and even a primitive photographic darkroom that had been used to copy sensitive documents. This was not amateur espionage. This was professional intelligence work that would have been impressive even by modern standards. As Rebecca explored deeper into the chamber, she discovered that Elena had been more than just a caretaker of these historical materials. Her grandmother had spent decades cataloging and preserving the documents, creating detailed inventories and cross-references that would have been invaluable to professional historians. Elena had also continued Isabella's work in a different form, using the intelligence network's descendant connections to support civil rights activities during the 1960s and refugee assistance programs. During various international conflicts, the chamber contained evidence of Elena's own covert activities, from helping Vietnamese refugees in the 1970s to supporting Central American asylum seekers in the 1980s. The realization that her family's history extended far beyond Elena's stories was overwhelming, but it also explained aspects of her grandmother's behavior that had puzzled Rebecca for years. Elena's uncanny knowledge of current events, her mysterious financial resources, and her network of contacts in academic and government circles suddenly made sense when viewed as extensions of skills and relationships that had been developed over generations. The Martinez family had been involved in intelligence work for more than a century, using their outsider status and multilingual abilities to facilitate activities that more established families couldn't have managed. But Elena's preservation work had gone beyond simply maintaining historical documents. She had also created detailed plans for revealing the network's existence when the time was right, complete with authentication protocols and distribution strategies that would ensure the information reached appropriate academic and governmental authorities. Rebecca found letters addressed to specific historians, copies of documents prepared for various archives, and even contact information for journalists who specialized in Civil War history. Elena had been preparing for this moment for decades, waiting for the right person to inherit not just the house, but the responsibility for sharing its secrets. The weight of that responsibility was becoming clear to Rebecca as she continued her exploration. These documents wouldn't just add footnotes to existing histories. They would fundamentally change understanding of Civil War intelligence operations and challenge accepted narratives about the period. The evidence of Isabella's network would prove that women had played far more significant roles in the conflict than previously recognized, that intelligence operations had been more sophisticated than historians had assumed, and that the war's end had not marked the conclusion of these activities. Publishing this information would attract attention from academic institutions, government agencies, and media organizations around the world, but revealing the network's existence would also expose Rebecca and Sophie to scrutiny that she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. Elena had lived quietly in Millbrook for decades, protecting these secrets while maintaining the facade of an eccentric widow with an interest in local history. Rebecca's military background and more assertive personality would make it harder to maintain that kind of anonymity, especially once the significance of her discovery became known. She would need to find allies who could help her navigate the complex process of revealing historical information that had been classified or suppressed for more than a century. The immediate challenge was authentication. Rebecca understood that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and she knew that the academic community would scrutinize every document with skepticism born of experience with historical hoaxes and forgeries. The chamber contained materials that would support authentication efforts, including provenance documentation and chemical analysis results that Elena had commissioned from various laboratories over the years. But Rebecca would need expert assistance to present the information in ways that would be credible to professional historians and government officials. Standing in the hidden chamber surrounded by evidence of her family's extraordinary past, Rebecca realized that her inheritance was far more significant than a house and its furnishings. Elena had entrusted her with secrets that could reshape understanding of American history. But she had also given her a choice about how and when to reveal those secrets. The letter Elena had left had mentioned trusting no one until she knew everything, advice that was beginning to make sense as Rebecca understood the full scope of what she had discovered. The immediate practical question was what to do next. Sophie would be getting hungry soon, and Rebecca needed to return to the mundane tasks of settling into their new home. But she also needed to develop a plan for protecting and eventually revealing the intelligence network's history, a process That would require careful thought and expert guidance. Elena had spent 40 years preparing for this moment, and Rebecca couldn't afford to make hasty decisions that might compromise the safety of the information or her family's security. As she prepared to leave the chamber, Rebecca noticed one final detail that made her understand the full extent of Elena's planning. Near the entrance, partially concealed behind one of the document cases, was a modern safe with an electronic lock. The combination, she realized, was probably Sophie's birthday, the kind of detail that Elena would have used to ensure that only Rebecca could access whatever final secrets the safe contained. But opening it would have to wait for another day, when she had more time to process the implications of what she had already discovered. The safe's combination was indeed Sophie's birthday, a detail that brought tears to Rebecca's eyes as she realized how carefully Elena had planned every aspect of this revelation. Inside, she found documents that were even more explosive than those in the main chamber, including correspondence with government officials that suggested the intelligence network had never truly been disbanded. There were letters from State Department officials, CIA contacts, and academic researchers who had been quietly working with Elena to preserve and study the historical materials while keeping their existence secret from the broader academic community. But the most shocking discovery was a folder labeled Current Operations that contained evidence of Elena's continued involvement in intelligence activities well into the 21st century. Her work with refugees and asylum seekers hadn't been simple humanitarian assistance. It had been part of an ongoing network that helped individuals escape political persecution in Central America, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. Elena had used the same skills and connections that Isabella had developed during the Civil War, adapted for modern circumstances, but serving similar humanitarian purposes. The implications were staggering. Rebecca realized that her grandmother hadn't just been preserving historical documents. She had been maintaining an active intelligence network that operated outside official government channels. The safe contained recent photographs, travel documents, and communication equipment that suggested Elena's activities had continued until shortly before her death. There were also detailed files on current political situations in various countries, analysis that would have been valuable to government agencies if they had known it existed. Rebecca's hands shook as she read through Elena's final instructions, which outlined the network's current operations and identified key contacts who would need to be notified of Elena's death. Her grandmother had been coordinating refugee assistance operations across 3 continents, using financial resources that came from careful investment of the family's intelligence earnings over multiple generations. The network included descendants of Isabella's original operatives, academics who specialized in conflict resolution, and current government officials who worked within the system to protect vulnerable populations. The realization that she had inherited not just historical documents, but an active intelligence operation was overwhelming. Rebecca's military background had given her security clearances and training that made her technically qualified to handle sensitive information, but she had never expected to be thrust into the kind of covert activities that Elena had been managing. The safe contained detailed protocols for various scenarios, including procedures for shutting down the network if it became compromised, and instructions for transferring operations to trusted associates if Elena became unable to continue her work. But Elena's final message made it clear that she had chosen Rebecca, specifically because of her military experience and her proven ability to make difficult decisions under pressure. The letter explained that the network needed someone who understood operational security, could evaluate threats and opportunities quickly, and had the moral courage to continue work that would never receive public recognition. Elena had been watching Rebecca's military career closely, and her decision to involve her granddaughter in the family's intelligence legacy had been based on careful assessment of her character and capabilities. The immediate challenge was determining which of Elena's contacts were trustworthy and which operations needed immediate attention. Rebecca found a secure communication device that Elena had used to maintain contact with network members, along with codes and protocols that would allow her to verify her identity to people who had never met her. But using the device would commit her to continuing Elena's work, a decision that would have profound implications for her and Sophie's future security and anonymity. As Rebecca struggled with the weight of these revelations, her quiet life in Millbrook was about to be disrupted by forces that had been building since her arrival in town. Dr. Whitmore had been conducting her own investigation into the Martinez family, driven by curiosity about Elena's mysterious past and concern about what Rebecca might have inherited along with the Thornfield Manor. Her research had uncovered inconsistencies in Elena's background that suggested connections to intelligence agencies, discoveries that Dr. Whitmore interpreted as evidence of dangerous criminal activity rather than legitimate government work. Dr. Whitmore's suspicions had been aroused by several factors that she had noticed during Elena's years in Millbrook. Elena's financial resources had seemed disproportionate to any visible income. Her knowledge of current events had been unusually detailed and often ahead of media reports, and her occasional visitors had included individuals whose backgrounds didn't match their stated reasons for being in town. Dr. Whitmore had documented these observations over the years, creating a file that she was now preparing to share with federal authorities. The conflict between Dr. Whitmore and Elena had deeper roots than most people in Millbrook realized. Dr. Whitmore's family had been prominent Confederate supporters during the Civil War, and several of her ancestors had been targeted by Isabella's intelligence network. While Dr. Whitmore didn't know the specific details of Isabella's activities, family stories had painted her as a treacherous spy who had betrayed Southern hospitality and contributed to Confederate defeats. Dr. Whitmore's hostility toward Elena had been partly motivated by these inherited grievances, even though she didn't fully understand their historical basis. Dr. Whitmore's investigation had been aided by Harold Prescott, a retired FBI agent who had moved to Millbrook 5 years earlier and had been suspicious of Elena's activities from the beginning. Prescott had spent his career investigating domestic security threats, and his training had made him sensitive to the kind of behavioral patterns that Elena displayed. He had been quietly gathering information about Elena for years, waiting for an opportunity to present his findings to appropriate authorities. Rebecca's arrival and her obvious access to Elena's private papers had created the urgency that Prescott needed to justify official intervention. The collaboration between Dr. Whitmore and Prescott had been developing gradually, bonded by their shared suspicion that Elena had been involved in activities that threatened national security. Dr. Whitmore provided historical context and local knowledge, while Prescott contributed investigative experience and contacts within federal law enforcement agencies. Together, they had built a case that portrayed Elena as a foreign agent who had used her position in Millbrook to conduct espionage activities for hostile governments. Their evidence was circumstantial but concerning enough to attract official attention. Elena's frequent international travel, her unexplained financial resources, and her extensive correspondence with individuals and countries that were considered security threats had created a pattern that suggested coordination with foreign intelligence services. The fact that she had maintained this lifestyle for decades without apparent legal scrutiny suggested either official protection or sophisticated operational security that indicated professional training. Rebecca was unaware of these developing threats as she continued to explore Elena's legacy and make decisions about her family's future. The hidden chamber had become her refuge from the overwhelming challenges of single parenthood and financial uncertainty, a place where she could immerse herself in historical mysteries that seemed more manageable than her current problems. But each day spent in the chamber brought new discoveries that complicated her understanding of Elena's activities and their implications for her own safety. The intelligence network's current operations were more extensive than Rebecca had initially realized Elena had been coordinating assistance for refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Central America, working with a network of contacts that included government officials, academic researchers, and humanitarian organizations. The work was legitimate and valuable, but it operated in legal gray areas that could be misinterpreted by investigators who didn't understand the historical context or humanitarian motivations that drove the network's activities. Rebecca found evidence that Elena had been particularly focused on helping individuals whose government service had made them targets for persecution in their home countries. The network had assisted translators who had worked with American military forces, intelligence analysts who had fled authoritarian regimes, and human rights activists who faced imprisonment or death if they remained in their native countries. These were exactly the kind of people that Rebecca had worked with during her military deployments, individuals whose courage and sacrifice deserved protection, but who often found themselves abandoned by the bureaucratic systems that had initially promised their support. The moral clarity of Elena's work was complicated by the methods she had used to achieve her humanitarian goals. The network had operated outside official channels, using forged documents, bribery, and other illegal means to move people across international borders and establish them in safe locations. Elena had justified these activities as necessary responses to government failures and bureaucratic delays that left vulnerable people exposed to deadly threats. But Rebecca understood that federal investigators would focus on the illegal methods rather than the humanitarian outcomes when evaluating Elena's activities. The financial aspects of the network's operations were equally complex. Elena had used inheritance money, investment profits, and contributions from wealthy supporters to fund refugee assistance, document forgery, and safe house operations across multiple countries. The money had been carefully laundered through legitimate charities and business enterprises to avoid detection by financial monitoring systems. Elena had maintained detailed records of these transactions, partly for operational security, and partly to ensure that the network's resources were used efficiently and ethically. But Rebecca realized that these same records could be used as evidence of money laundering and conspiracy charges if they fell into the wrong hands. Elena's careful documentation, intended to ensure accountability and prevent corruption, could be interpreted as evidence of criminal enterprise by investigators who didn't understand the network's humanitarian purposes. The safe contained instructions for destroying these records if the network became compromised, but Rebecca was reluctant to eliminate evidence of her grandmother's extraordinary humanitarian work. The emotional weight of these discoveries was compounded by Rebecca's growing understanding of the sacrifices that Elena had made to maintain the network's operations. Her grandmother had lived in isolation for decades, unable to share her work with friends or family members who might not understand or approve of her activities. She had forgone normal relationships and conventional recognition to protect people whose names would never be known publicly and whose gratitude could never be expressed safely. Elena's journals revealed the psychological toll of this work, the constant stress of managing operations that could result in imprisonment or death if they were discovered by hostile governments. She had lived with the knowledge that her activities put not only herself, but also her network contacts and the people they were trying to help at risk. The responsibility for other people's lives had shaped every decision she made, from her choice to live quietly in Millbrook to her careful planning for transferring network operations to Rebecca. The technical sophistication of Elena's operations was impressive, even by Rebecca's military standards. The secure communication systems, document forgery capabilities, and financial transfer mechanisms that Elena had developed over decades represented professional-level intelligence work that rivaled official government programs. Elena had maintained these capabilities through continuous learning and adaptation, staying current with technological developments and security threats that could compromise her network's effectiveness. But this sophistication also represented a vulnerability that Rebecca was only beginning to understand. The same technologies and methods that had made Elena's humanitarian work possible had also created digital footprints and communication patterns that could be detected by government surveillance systems. If Dr. Whitmore and Harold Prescott succeeded in attracting federal attention to Elena's activities, investigators would find evidence of a sophisticated intelligence operation that would be difficult to explain or defend without revealing information that would compromise ongoing operations and endanger current network participants. Rebecca's military training had taught her to assess threats and develop contingency plans, skills that were becoming increasingly relevant as she understood the scope of her inheritance. She needed to decide quickly whether to continue Elena's work, shut down the network's operations, or find ways to transfer responsibility to other participants who were better positioned to manage the risks involved. Each option carried significant consequences for the people who depended on the network's assistance and for Rebecca's own family's security. The immediate threat came from sources that Rebecca was still unaware of. But the evidence was building toward a confrontation that would test everything Elena had taught her about the importance of protecting vulnerable people regardless of personal cost. Dr. Whitmore's investigation was approaching the point where federal intervention would become inevitable, and Rebecca's window for making crucial decisions about her family's future was rapidly closing. Standing in the hidden chamber, surrounded by evidence of 5 generations of intelligence work, Rebecca realized that her inheritance was both a tremendous honor and a potentially deadly burden. Elena had given her the tools and knowledge needed to continue work that had saved hundreds of lives over the decades, but she had also placed her in a position where the wrong decision could result in imprisonment, exile, or worse. The choice she made in the coming days would determine not only her own fate, but also the survival of a humanitarian network that had been operating in various forms for more than a century and a half. The Historical Society meeting convened on a cold November evening in the converted train depot that served as Millbrook's repository of official memory. Dr. Whitmore had called the emergency session under the pretense of discussing recently discovered irregularities in local historical records, but the 12 society members who attended sensed that something more significant was at stake. The room's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across display cases filled with Civil War artifacts that suddenly seemed inadequate compared to what might be hidden in other collections around town. Rebecca had decided to attend the meeting, despite her growing unease about Dr. Whitmore's intentions. Sophie was spending the evening with a babysitter, a high school student whose family had welcomed the Martinez women with the kind of genuine warmth that made small-town life bearable. Rebecca wore a simple black dress that she hoped would project respectability while avoiding the kind of attention that might complicate whatever confrontation was developing. She carried a leather portfolio that contained carefully selected documents from Elena's collection, evidence that she was prepared to reveal if circumstances required it. Dr. Whitmore began the meeting with a presentation that she had clearly been preparing for weeks. Using a slide projector that belonged in a museum itself, she displayed a timeline of Elena Martinez's residence in Millbrook that highlighted inconsistencies and unanswered questions about her background. Elena's purchase of the Thornfield Manor for cash in 1978, her extensive travels during the 1980s and 1990s, and her knowledge of historical details that weren't available in published sources were presented as evidence of suspicious activity that warranted investigation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Whitmore announced with the kind of theatrical gravity that she brought to all her presentations, "we have been harboring someone whose activities may have compromised the integrity of our historical records and possibly our community's security." Mrs. Martinez claimed to possess knowledge about Civil War intelligence operations that she said came from family sources, but she consistently refused to provide documentation that would allow us to verify her claims. Harold Prescott sat in the back row, his FBI credentials giving weight to his presence, even though he was officially retired. He had spent the afternoon reviewing files that Dr. Whitmore had compiled over the years, documents that painted Elena as a possible foreign agent who had used her position in the community to conduct surveillance and intelligence gathering. Prescott's law enforcement background made him naturally suspicious of individuals who maintained the kind of operational security that Elena had displayed throughout her residence in Millbrook. The society members listened with varying degrees of skepticism and fascination as Dr. Whitmore outlined her theory that Elena had been working for hostile foreign governments, using her extensive knowledge of American Civil War history to establish credibility while gathering intelligence about current military and political activities. The evidence was circumstantial but troubling, particularly Elena's apparent access to financial resources that seemed disproportionate to any visible income and her network of contacts that included individuals with connections to foreign governments. Rebecca remained silent during the first part of Dr. Whitmore's presentation, recognizing that premature intervention might reveal information that would endanger the humanitarian network that Elena had spent decades building. But as Dr. Whitmore's accusations became more specific and more damaging to Elena's memory, Rebecca realized that she would need to respond with evidence that could redirect the conversation toward historical truth rather than paranoid speculation. The turning point came when Dr. Whitmore displayed a photograph that she claimed showed Elena meeting with a known foreign intelligence operative in Washington, D.C. during the 1990s. The photograph was genuine, but Dr. Whitmore's interpretation was completely wrong. Rebecca recognized the other person in the photograph as someone Elena had described in her private journals, a refugee advocate who had worked with the network to resettle individuals fleeing political persecution in Eastern Europe following the collapse of communist governments. Dr. Whitmore, Rebecca said, rising from her seat with the kind of calm authority that she had learned during service, I believe you have misinterpreted both the significance of that photograph and the nature of my grandmother's activities in this community. Before you make accusations that could damage reputations and compromise ongoing humanitarian work, perhaps you should examine the evidence that Elena actually left behind. The room fell silent as Rebecca opened her portfolio and withdrew a Civil War-era photograph that showed a group of women in period dress, standing in front of the Thornfield Manor. The women's faces were clearly visible, and one of them bore a striking resemblance to Elena Martinez. But more significantly, the photograph was annotated in Spanish with names and dates that placed it firmly in the 1860s, decades before photography became common in rural Virginia. This photograph was taken in 1864, Rebecca explained, passing the image to the society members for examination. The woman who resembles my grandmother is Isabella Vasquez, my great-great-grandmother, who operated one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks of the entire Civil War period. The Thornfield Manor wasn't just a residence. It was the headquarters for operations that influenced major battles and saved countless lives on both sides of the conflict. Dr. Whitmore's face paled as she examined the photograph, recognizing immediately that its authenticity would be difficult to challenge. The paper was clearly period appropriate. The photographic techniques were consistent with 1860s technology, and the women's clothing and hairstyles matched the era perfectly. But more disturbing to Dr. Whitmore was the realization that this photograph represented evidence of exactly the kind of intelligence operations that her family's oral history had warned her about. Harold Prescott moved closer to examine the photograph, his investigative instincts immediately engaged by the implications of what Rebecca was revealing. If the photograph was authentic, it suggested that the Martinez family had been involved in intelligence work for more than a century, operating with levels of sophistication that would have required government sanction or at least official tolerance. Prescott's concerns about Elena's activities suddenly took on a different character as he considered the possibility that she had been continuing family traditions rather than working for hostile foreign powers. Rebecca continued her presentation by displaying additional documents that she had selected carefully from Elena's collection. Letters written in multiple languages, maps showing troop movements and supply routes, and coded communications that demonstrated the network's extraordinary scope and effectiveness during the Civil War period. Each piece of evidence supported her claim that the Martinez family had been involved in legitimate intelligence work that served American interests, even when that work required operating outside official channels. Isabella Vasquez was a double agent who provided information to both Confederate and Union forces while pursuing her own agenda of minimizing civilian casualties and hastening the war's end. Rebecca explained, displaying a letter that showed Isabella's correspondence with Union intelligence officials. Her network included dozens of operatives from both sides of the conflict, all working toward the common goal of reducing the war's human cost while gathering intelligence that influenced major strategic decisions. The society members examined the documents with growing amazement, recognizing that they were looking at historical materials that could revolutionize understanding of Civil War intelligence operations. Dr. Whitmore found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge the authenticity of evidence that contradicted her accusations while supporting theories about female intelligence operatives that she had previously dismissed as romantic fantasy. But Rebecca's most shocking revelation came when she displayed a document that showed Isabella's network had continued operating well into the Reconstruction period, working to prevent post-war violence and protect both former slaves and Confederate officials from extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. The network had evolved from wartime intelligence gathering to peacekeeping and humanitarian assistance, establishing patterns that had continued through subsequent generations of the Martinez family. Elena Martinez wasn't a foreign spy, Rebecca stated with quiet conviction. She was continuing work that her family had been doing for more than a century, using intelligence skills and international contacts to protect vulnerable people and promote American values around the world. Her activities in Millbrook weren't surveillance operations against her neighbors. They were part of humanitarian efforts that helped refugees, asylum seekers, and political dissidents escape persecution in their home countries. Prescott's expression shifted from suspicion to professional interest as he considered the implications of Rebecca's revelations. If the Martinez family had indeed been involved in legitimate intelligence work for multiple generations, Elena's activities would take on a completely different significance. Instead of representing a security threat, her work might have been contributing to American foreign policy objectives through unofficial channels that provided plausible deniability for government officials. The authentication process began immediately, with society members examining the documents for signs of forgery or manipulation. Dr. Whitmore's expertise in historical analysis was considerable, and despite her personal bias against Elena's memory, she was forced to acknowledge that the materials appeared to be genuine period pieces. The paper, ink, and photographic techniques were all consistent with their claimed dates, and the level of historical detail would have been impossible to fake convincingly. But the most compelling evidence came from cross-referencing Rebecca's documents with materials that were already in the Historical Society's collection. Several items that had been donated anonymously over the years suddenly made sense when viewed as part of Isabella's intelligence network. A coded letter that had been dismissed as a curiosity, a map with mysterious markings that had puzzled researchers for decades, and even a daguerreotype that showed unidentified individuals in front of the Thornfield manor all fit into the larger pattern Rebecca was revealing. The society members began to realize that they had been sitting on one of the most significant historical discoveries in Virginia's Civil War research, materials that had been hidden in plain sight while they focused on more conventional artifacts and documents. Elena's anonymous donations to the Historical Society suddenly took on new meaning as they understood that she had been gradually revealing her family's legacy while maintaining operational security for ongoing humanitarian activities. Dr. Whitmore faced a professional and personal crisis as the evidence mounted against her accusations. Her scholarly reputation depended on her ability to evaluate historical sources accurately, and her misinterpretation of Elena's activities threatened to undermine her credibility within academic circles. But more personally troubling was the realization that her family's oral traditions about treacherous Civil War spies might have been distorted accounts of legitimate intelligence operations that had actually served the Union cause. The meeting that had been intended to expose Elena Martinez as a security threat was transforming into a celebration of an extraordinary historical discovery. Society members began discussing plans for academic conferences, museum exhibitions, and scholarly publications that would bring appropriate recognition to Isabella's network and Elena's preservation efforts. The materials that Rebecca had revealed represented the kind of primary source documentation that historians dreamed of finding, evidence that could support doctoral dissertations and reshape textbook narratives about Civil War intelligence operations. But Rebecca's presentation also raised uncomfortable questions about the Historical Society's failure to recognize the significance of Elena's contributions during her lifetime. Several members remembered Elena's attempts to share information about female intelligence operatives and the sophisticated nature of Civil War espionage activities, theories that had been dismissed as speculation because Elena had been unwilling to reveal her sources. The realization that Elena had been protecting legitimate historical materials while trying to contribute to scholarly understanding created a sense of collective guilt about their treatment of her, preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Harold Prescott found himself reassessing not only Elena's activities, but also the broader implications of family-based intelligence networks that operated across multiple generations. His FBI experience had focused primarily on foreign espionage threats and domestic terrorism, but he was beginning to understand that there might be American intelligence traditions that operated outside official government channels while serving national interests. Elena's work with refugees and asylum seekers could be viewed as extending American influence and values internationally, activities that complemented rather than threatened official foreign policy objectives. The immediate challenge facing the Historical Society was determining how to handle information that had obvious national security implications. Rebecca's revelations about her family's intelligence work raised questions about ongoing operations that might be compromised by public disclosure. The Society members understood that they were dealing with materials that required careful handling. To protect both historical integrity and contemporary security concerns, Dr. Whitmore's accusatory presentation had backfired spectacularly, transforming her from an authority figure exposing dangerous activities into someone who had nearly compromised legitimate historical preservation and ongoing humanitarian work. Her relationship with Harold Prescott became strained as he realized that her personal biases had distorted her interpretation of evidence in ways that could have had serious consequences for Rebecca's family and Elena's network. But the evening's revelations also created new vulnerabilities for Rebecca, who had been forced to expose more information about her family's activities than she had initially intended. The Historical Society members were trustworthy individuals, but word of such extraordinary discoveries would inevitably spread beyond the converted train depot, attracting attention from academic institutions, government agencies, and media. Organizations that might not share the community's protective instincts toward the Martinez family. As the meeting concluded with excited discussions about authentication procedures and scholarly collaboration, Rebecca realized that she had crossed a threshold that would make anonymity impossible. Elena's carefully maintained operational security had been breached, not by hostile investigators, but by the need to defend her memory against false accusations. The choice to reveal Isabella's intelligence network had been necessary to protect Elena's reputation, but it had also committed Rebecca to a path that would bring both recognition and scrutiny that she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. Rebecca's demonstration of her family's historical legacy at the Historical Society meeting had immediate and far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond Millbrook's small academic community. Within 48 hours of her presentation, word of the Isabella Vasquez Intelligence Network had reached Civil War historians at the University of Virginia, the National Archives, and the Smithsonian Institution. Dr. Patricia Chun, a renowned expert on Civil War espionage operations at Georgetown University, called Rebecca personally to request access to the documents. Her voice trembling with excitement as she described the potential impact of such discoveries on established historical narratives. The authentication process began with a level of scientific rigor that impressed even Rebecca's military-trained skepticism. Dr. Chun arrived in Millbrook with a team of specialists including a forensic document examiner, a photographic historian, and a chemical analysis expert who could determine the age and composition of paper, ink, and photographic materials using non-destructive testing methods. The team worked in the Thornfield Manors Library, which Rebecca had converted into a temporary research facility, while maintaining strict security protocols to protect the materials from damage or theft. The initial results were unequivocal. Carbon dating of the paper samples confirmed their mid-19th century origins, while spectroscopic analysis of the ink compositions matched formulations that were available during the Civil War period but had been replaced by synthetic alternatives by the 1880s. The photographic techniques used in Isabella's collection were consistent with albumin printing processes that had been standard during the 1860s, but were rarely used after 1880. Most convincingly, the chemical composition of the photographic emulsions contained trace elements that were characteristic of silver nitrate solutions, prepared using 19th century purification methods. But the historical content of the documents provided even more compelling evidence of their authenticity. Isabella's correspondence contained references to specific military events, political developments, and personal relationships that could be cross-referenced with other historical sources from the period. Her letters mentioned Union officers whose service records were documented in military archives, Confederate officials whose activities were recorded in government documents, and civilian contacts whose involvement in intelligence operations had been suspected but never proven by previous researchers. Dr. Chun's preliminary analysis revealed that Isabella's network had been far more sophisticated and influential than even Rebecca had initially realized. The documents showed that Isabella had maintained direct correspondence with senior Union intelligence officials, including contact with Alan Pinkerton's detective agency and coordination with the Bureau of Military Information that had been established by General Joseph Hooker in 1863. Her intelligence reports had influenced Union strategy during the Peninsula Campaign, provided early warning of Confederate troop movements before the Battle of Gettysburg, and contributed to the disruption of Confederate supply lines throughout Virginia. The network's post-war activities were equally impressive, demonstrating how Isabella had adapted her intelligence capabilities to address the challenges of Reconstruction. Her operatives had infiltrated Ku Klux Klan chapters throughout Virginia, providing advance warning of planned attacks on freed slaves and Republican officials. The network had also gathered intelligence on corrupt federal officials who were exploiting their positions for personal gain, information that had been passed to reform-minded politicians in Washington who used it to support anti-corruption investigations. Rebecca watched the authentication process with mixed emotions. Understanding that each confirmed detail brought her family closer to historical recognition, while also exposing them to scrutiny that could compromise ongoing humanitarian operations. Elena's network was still active, and several of its participants were working in sensitive positions where exposure could result in imprisonment, exile, or death. The secure communication device that Elena had left contained messages from operatives in Syria, Afghanistan, and Central America who were depending on continued support from the Martinez family's resources and connections. The moral complexity of Rebecca's situation became clear as she realized that protecting her family's historical legacy might require sacrificing its contemporary humanitarian mission. The academic recognition that Isabella's network deserved could only be achieved through publication and public discussion that would inevitably attract government attention to Elena's activities. Rebecca found herself caught between honoring her ancestors' extraordinary achievements and protecting the vulnerable people who depended on the network's continued secrecy. Dr. Chen seemed to understand these concerns, approaching Rebecca with the kind of sensitivity that suggested experience with similar dilemmas. Historical truth and contemporary security don't always align, she acknowledged during a private conversation in the Manners study. But there are ways to reveal the historical significance of your family's work while protecting information that could compromise ongoing operations. We can focus on the Civil War period while keeping more recent activities confidential until it's safe to discuss them openly. The compromise that Dr. Chen proposed involved a carefully managed publication strategy that would reveal Isabella's Civil War intelligence network while maintaining ambiguity about the family's subsequent activities. The Historical Society would serve as the official repository for the Civil War-era documents, while more recent materials would remain under Rebecca's private control. Academic publications would focus on the 19th century operations, providing sufficient historical context to establish the network's significance without exposing contemporary participants to unnecessary risks. But even this careful approach carried dangers that Rebecca was still learning to assess. Harold Prescott had become an unexpected ally following the Historical Society meeting, using his FBI contacts to provide unofficial guidance about potential security risks associated with revealing the network's existence. His analysis suggested that several foreign intelligence agencies would be very interested in learning about American intelligence networks that operated outside official government channels, particularly if those networks had demonstrated the kind of longevity and effectiveness that the Martinez family had maintained. Prescott's concerns were validated when Rebecca discovered that her phone conversations were being monitored and her internet activity was being tracked by unknown parties. The surveillance was sophisticated enough to suggest government involvement, though Prescott couldn't determine whether it originated from American agencies conducting routine security assessments or foreign services gathering intelligence about the newly revealed network. Either way, the attention indicated that Rebecca's family had moved beyond academic curiosity into the realm of national security interest. The pressure increased when Rebecca received a visit from Agent Sarah Coleman of the Department of Homeland Security, who arrived at the Thornfield Manor with credentials that Prescott verified as genuine. Agent Coleman was a specialist in domestic security threats who had been tasked with evaluating the implications of the Martinez family's intelligence activities. Her questions were polite but probing, designed to determine whether Elena's humanitarian network posed risks to American security interests or represented assets that could be useful to official government operations. Agent Coleman's investigation revealed the extraordinary scope of Elena's post-war activities, which had included assistance to political dissidents from Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe during the 1980s, support for refugees fleeing conflicts in Central America during the 1990s, and more recent work with individuals who had served as translators and guides for American military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. The network had operated with remarkable consistency across multiple decades, adapting its methods to changing political circumstances while maintaining its core mission of protecting vulnerable people from political persecution. The government's interest in Elena's network was complicated by the realization that many of the people she had helped had subsequently provided valuable intelligence to American agencies through their integration into refugee communities and their ongoing contacts with opposition groups in their home countries. Elena's humanitarian work had created intelligence assets that official government programs had been unable to develop, suggesting that her activities had actually supported rather than threatened American security interests. Rebecca found herself navigating increasingly complex negotiations with academic researchers, government officials, and media representatives, who all wanted access to her family's historical materials for different purposes. Dr. Chun was focused on the scholarly implications of Isabella's Civil War network, while Agent Coleman was more interested in understanding Elena's contemporary operations and their potential continuation under Rebecca's management. Journalists from major newspapers and television networks were requesting interviews about the discovery, sensing that the story of a Civil War spy network that had continued operating for more than a century would capture public imagination. Attention was overwhelming for someone who had expected to live quietly in Millbrook while raising her daughter and adjusting to civilian life. Rebecca's military training had prepared her for operational security and crisis management, but not for the kind of media scrutiny and academic debate that surrounded major historical discoveries. The Thornfield Manor, which had been a refuge from her financial and personal struggles, was becoming the center of international attention that threatened to destroy the privacy that Elena had maintained for decades. Sophie was adapting to the chaos with the resilience that children often display when their world changes rapidly. But Rebecca worried about the long-term impact of their sudden notoriety on her daughter's development and security. The babysitters and teachers who had welcomed them to Millbrook were now dealing with reporters and researchers who wanted information about the Martinez family's daily routines and personal relationships. The small-town anonymity that had made their new life possible was evaporating as quickly as Elena's carefully maintained secrets. The transformation was most visible in Rebecca's relationship with the Millbrook community, where she had evolved from a struggling single mother into a figure of international historical significance. Dr. Whitmore's accusations had been completely discredited, forcing her to issue public apologies, while privately grappling with the realization that her family's oral traditions about Civil War spies had been distorted versions of legitimate intelligence operations. The Historical Society was experiencing unprecedented attention from academic institutions that wanted to collaborate on research projects and museum exhibitions. Mayor Bobby Carlyle found himself managing the kind of media attention that Millbrook had never experienced, with national news crews setting up equipment on Main Street and hotel rooms being booked by researchers and government officials from around the country. The economic impact was significant, with local businesses experiencing increased revenue from the influx of visitors, but the disruption to normal community life was considerable. Bobby had to balance the town's excitement about its newfound historical importance with residents' concerns about privacy and security. The most profound changes were occurring within Rebecca herself, as she came to understand the full weight of her inheritance and the responsibilities that came with continuing her family's legacy. Elena's network was still active, with operatives in dangerous situations who depended on continued support and coordination. The humanitarian mission that had motivated Isabella's original intelligence work remained relevant in a world where political persecution, ethnic violence, and authoritarian oppression created new populations of vulnerable people who needed protection. Rebecca's military experience had given her the skills and temperament needed to manage complex operations under pressure. But the scope of Elena's network was far beyond anything she had encountered during her military service. The financial resources, international contacts, and operational infrastructure that Elena had developed over decades represented a level of sophistication that rivaled official government programs. Continuing this work would require Rebecca to become the kind of intelligence operative that Elena had been, operating in shadows while maintaining the facade of normal civilian life. The secure communication device that Elena had left contained increasingly urgent messages from network participants who needed guidance about ongoing operations and reassurance that the network would continue functioning despite Elena's death. Rebecca found herself making decisions about refugee assistance, document forgery, and safe house operations in multiple countries, choices that could determine whether vulnerable people lived or died. The weight of these responsibilities was enormous, but Rebecca was beginning to understand that this had always been her family's burden and privilege. The historical recognition that Isabella's network was receiving provided context for the contemporary humanitarian work that Elena had continued, but it also created pressure for Rebecca to make definitive choices about her family's future. She could embrace the academic attention and government interest, potentially gaining official support for the network's humanitarian mission while sacrificing the operational security that had protected it for generations. Alternatively, she could withdraw from public attention and maintain the network's secrecy, preserving its effectiveness while denying Isabella and Elena the historical recognition they deserved. Standing in the hidden chamber where Isabella had coordinated intelligence operations that had influenced the course of American history, Rebecca realized that her choice would determine not only her own future, but also the survival of the humanitarian tradition that had protected vulnerable people for more than a century. The documents surrounding her represented both her family's extraordinary past and the foundation for whatever role she chose to play in continuing their legacy of service in the shadows of official history. The final revelation came not from the historical documents or Elena's contemporary files, but from a source that Rebecca had never expected to encounter. Dr. Chin's authentication team had completed their initial analysis and was preparing to leave Millbrook when they received an unexpected visitor at the Thornfield Manor. Professor James Whitfield arrived without advance notice, driving up the manor's circular driveway in a government sedan that immediately attracted Harold Prescott's attention from his surveillance position across the street. Professor Whitfield was a distinguished academic from Harvard University, but his credentials told only part of his story. Rebecca recognized him immediately from Elena's private files as someone who had been instrumental in coordinating the intelligence network's academic connections over the past 2 decades. His arrival represented the activation of protocols that Elena had established for exactly this kind of exposure, contingency plans that would either protect the network's ongoing operations or facilitate its orderly dissolution if continuation became impossible. "Ms. Martinez," Professor Whitfield said as he entered the manor's foyer, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of managing sensitive operations. "Your grandmother asked me to contact you if circumstances ever required full disclosure of our network's activities. I believe we have reached that point." His presence immediately shifted the dynamics of the situation, transforming what had been an academic discovery into something with far more significant implications for national security and international relations. Dr. Chun and her authentication team found themselves witnesses to conversations that went far beyond their expertise in Civil War history. Professor Whitfield's briefing revealed that Elena's network had been operating with unofficial government awareness for decades, providing services that official agencies couldn't perform due to legal restrictions or diplomatic considerations. The network's humanitarian mission had been genuine, but it had also served intelligence-gathering functions that had provided valuable information to American policymakers. The scope of the network's contemporary operations was staggering. Professor Whitfield displayed maps and organizational charts that showed active cells in 17 countries, with participants who included academics, journalists, humanitarian workers, and former military personnel who shared the network's commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. The financial resources that supported these operations came from multiple sources, including Elena's careful investments, contributions from wealthy supporters who valued the network's humanitarian mission, and occasional unofficial government funding for specific operations. Rebecca learned that her military service had been monitored by network recruiters who had been assessing her suitability for eventual participation in family operations. Her security clearances, combat experience, and demonstrated ability to work with international partners in sensitive situations had made her an ideal candidate to continue Elena's work. The timing of Elena's death and Rebecca's transition to civilian life had created an opportunity for network leadership transition that had been planned for years, but Professor Whitfield also revealed that the network faced unprecedented threats that made Rebecca's decision about continuing its operations more urgent and dangerous than she had realized. Several foreign intelligence services had become aware of the network's existence through surveillance of its participants, and hostile governments were actively working to identify and eliminate operatives who had helped political dissidents escape persecution. The exposure of Isabella's Civil War intelligence work had attracted additional attention from agencies that were now investigating possible connections between historical and contemporary operations. The immediate threat came from an unexpected source that demonstrated how quickly the situation had evolved beyond academic interest. Agent Coleman's investigation had been part of a broader government assessment of unofficial intelligence networks that might be compromised by foreign penetration. Her superiors at the Department of Homeland Security had concluded that Elena's network represented either a valuable asset that should be brought under official control or a security risk that needed to be eliminated to prevent foreign exploitation. Professor Whitfield's arrival had been triggered by intelligence indicating that foreign operatives were already in the United States, conducting surveillance of Rebecca and other network participants. The authentication team's presence at the Thornfield Manor had provided cover for hostile intelligence gathering, with at least 2 of the supposed academic researchers actually working for foreign services that wanted to understand the network's capabilities and identify its participants. Dr. Chun herself was genuine, but her team had been infiltrated in ways that neither she nor Rebecca had detected. The realization that hostile operatives had been operating within the manor while Rebecca explored Elena's most sensitive materials was terrifying, but it also demonstrated the network's continued relevance and the dangers faced by its participants. Professor Whitfield's security protocols immediately went into effect, with trusted personnel conducting electronic sweeps of the manor and establishing secure communication links with network cells that might be compromised by the Millbrook exposure. Rebecca found herself thrust into the kind of crisis management that her military training had prepared her for. But the stakes were higher than anything she had encountered during her deployments to Afghanistan. The decisions she made in the next few hours would determine not only her own family safety, but also the survival of humanitarian operations that protected vulnerable people around the world. The network's participants were counting on her to either continue Elena's leadership or manage a transition that would preserve their security while maintaining critical operations. The authentication of Isabella's Civil War documents had become secondary to more immediate security concerns. But Professor Whitfield explained how the historical revelation connected to contemporary threats. The publicity surrounding the discovery had provided foreign intelligence services with opportunities to conduct surveillance under academic cover, using the legitimate interest in Civil War history to mask more sinister intelligence gathering activities. The network's historical legacy had become both its greatest asset and its most dangerous vulnerability. Dr. Chun's team was evacuated from the manor under security protocols that Rebecca was only beginning to understand, with their research materials secured in ways that would prevent unauthorized access while preserving the academic integrity of their work. The transition from open historical research to covert security operations happened so quickly that Rebecca barely had time to process the implications before she found herself making decisions about operational security that would have been Elena's responsibility just days earlier. The most difficult choice involved Sophie, whose safety had become Professor Whitfield's primary concern as he assessed the threats facing Rebecca's family. The network maintained safe houses and security procedures for protecting participants' families, but using them would commit Rebecca to continuing Elena's work while eliminating any possibility of returning to the quiet life in Millbrook that she had hoped to build. The alternative was accepting government protection that would bring official oversight of the network's operations while potentially compromising its humanitarian mission. Harold Prescott's role in the developing crisis revealed another layer of Elena's planning that Rebecca had not previously understood. His FBI background and his decision to move to Millbrook had not been coincidental. He had been recruited by Elena as a security consultant who could provide early warning of government interest in the network's activities. His investigation of Elena's background had been genuine, but it had also served as a test of the network's operational security and a way to identify potential threats before they became critical. Prescott's analysis of the current situation was sobering but not hopeless. The network's exposure was significant but not complete, and several of its most important operations could continue if proper security measures were implemented immediately. The key was managing the transition from Elena's leadership to whatever structure would replace it, whether that involved Rebecca's assumption of control, dissolution of the network, or integration with official government programs that could provide legal protection while limiting operational flexibility. The choice that Rebecca faced was not simply personal, but historical, determining whether a humanitarian tradition that had begun with Isabella's Civil War intelligence work would continue into the 21st century or end with Elena's death. The network's participants around the world were waiting for guidance that would determine their own safety and the fate of the people they were trying to protect. Rebecca's decision would affect the lives of hundreds of individuals who had never met her but whose survival depended on the network's continued operation. Agent Coleman's return to the manor with a larger team of federal investigators marked the end of Rebecca's window for independent decision-making. The government's interest in the network had evolved from assessment to active intervention, with officials who wanted to either control or eliminate operations that they considered security risks. Coleman's new orders gave her authority to detain network participants and seize materials that might compromise national security, powers that could be used to destroy the humanitarian mission that had motivated Elena's work. But Professor Whitfield had anticipated this development, activating protocols that Elena had established to protect the network's most sensitive operations and participants. Financial assets were transferred to secure accounts, communication systems were switched to backup channels, and key personnel were moved to safe locations where they could continue critical humanitarian work while avoiding government detention. The network's survival would depend on Rebecca's ability to negotiate with federal authorities, while protecting the people who depended on its services. The negotiation that followed tested everything that Rebecca had learned about leadership, diplomacy, and crisis management during her military career. Agent Coleman represented the government's legitimate concerns about unofficial intelligence operations that might be compromised by foreign penetration, while Professor Whitfield advocated for the network's humanitarian mission and its value as an unofficial asset for American foreign policy objectives. Rebecca found herself mediating between competing interests, while trying to protect both national security and the vulnerable people who depended on the network's assistance. The compromise that emerged from these negotiations reflected the complex realities of modern intelligence work and the continuing relevance of the humanitarian principles that had motivated Isabella's original operations. The network would continue operating under informal government oversight, with official protection for its participants in exchange for coordination with authorized agencies and transparency about its humanitarian activities. Rebecca would assume leadership of the network's operations, using her military background and security clearances to provide the kind of professional management that Elena had maintained through different methods. The transformation of the Thornfield Manor from a private residence into the headquarters of an official intelligence support operation marked the completion of a journey that had begun with Isabella's Civil War activities and continued through Elena's decades of humanitarian work. The hidden chamber where Isabella had coordinated operations during the 1860s would now serve as a secure communication center for 21st-century humanitarian missions. While the manor's public spaces would accommodate the academic research and historical preservation that would honor the network's extraordinary legacy, Rebecca's acceptance of her role as the network's new leader represented not just a personal choice but a commitment to continuing family traditions that had protected vulnerable people for more than a century and a half. Sophie would grow up understanding her family's history and her own potential role in continuing work that had saved hundreds of lives while serving American values and interests around the world. The Martinez family's intelligence legacy would continue, adapted for contemporary challenges, but motivated by the same humanitarian principles that had inspired Isabella's original network, the story of the single mother who had inherited a creepy mansion and discovered a Civil War spy network in its basement had evolved into something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. Rebecca's inheritance had included not just historical documents and family secrets, but the responsibility for continuing humanitarian work that connected directly to contemporary global challenges. The vault in the mansion's basement had revealed not just the past, but a pathway to a future where intelligence operations and humanitarian assistance could work together to protect the vulnerable and serve the cause of human dignity in an increasingly dangerous world. Standing in Isabella's former command center, now equipped with modern communication technology that would coordinate humanitarian operations across multiple continents, Rebecca understood that her inheritance was both a burden and an extraordinary privilege. The network that Elena had maintained would continue under her leadership, adapted for new challenges, but committed to the same principles that had motivated 5 generations of the Martinez family to risk their lives in service of others who had no other protection against the forces that threatened their survival and freedom. 6 months after the revelation of Isabella's intelligence network, the Thornfield Manor had been transformed into something that balanced historical preservation with operational necessity. The Virginia Historical Landmark Commission had designated the property as a site of national significance, while carefully worded preservation orders protected the mansion's structural integrity without interfering with the sensitive activities that now took place within its walls. Rebecca had learned to navigate the complex requirements of maintaining both a historical site and an active intelligence operation, skills that required constant coordination between academic researchers, government officials, and network operatives. The manor's public areas hosted rotating exhibitions about Civil War intelligence operations that drew thousands of visitors annually, generating revenue that supported both historical preservation and humanitarian activities. Dr. Chun had established a permanent research center in the manor's East Wing, where scholars from around the world studied Isabella's documents while remaining unaware of the more contemporary operations taking place in other parts of the building. The arrangement provided perfect cover for the network's activities, with academic conferences and research seminars masking the presence of operatives who arrived under scholarly credentials. Rebecca's role as the network's leader had evolved far beyond anything Elena had prepared her for, requiring skills that combined her military training with diplomatic abilities she was still developing. The network now coordinated operations in 23 countries, with participants who included former intelligence officers, humanitarian workers, academic researchers, and business professionals who shared the organization's commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. The scope of their work had expanded to include refugee assistance, political asylum coordination, witness protection for individuals testifying against authoritarian regimes, and early warning systems for communities facing ethnic or political violence. The financial resources supporting these operations came from sources that would have been impossible for Elena to access during her decades of independent operation. Professor Whitfield had revealed that the network's humanitarian mission had attracted support from wealthy philanthropists, technology entrepreneurs, and even foreign governments that valued its ability to provide assistance in situations where official diplomatic channels were ineffective. The annual budget for network operations now exceeded $50 million, with funds carefully distributed through legitimate charities and business enterprises that provided operational cover while ensuring accountability. But the network's growth had also created vulnerabilities that required constant attention from Rebecca and her security staff. The increased scale of operations meant more participants, larger financial transactions, and greater visibility to hostile intelligence services that continued trying to penetrate or destroy the organization. 3 attempted infiltrations had been detected and neutralized during Rebecca's first 6 months of leadership, including one effort by Russian intelligence operatives who had tried to recruit network participants in Eastern Europe. The most significant challenge came from an unexpected source that demonstrated how the network's success had created new categories of enemies. Viktor Kozlov was a former KGB officer who had become a wealthy oligarch following the Soviet Union's collapse, using his intelligence background and government connections to build a business empire that depended on political corruption and human trafficking. The network's assistance to his victims had cost him millions of dollars in lost revenue while exposing operations that he had spent years developing. Kozlov's retaliation began with targeted attacks on network safehouses in Moldova and Romania, operations that resulted in the deaths of 3 operatives and the capture of documents that revealed the identities of participants in other countries. Rebecca's first major crisis as network leader involved coordinating emergency evacuations while developing countermeasures that could protect remaining operations from Kozlov's increasingly sophisticated attacks. The situation required her to work directly with CIA operatives and European intelligence services that had previously maintained only informal awareness of the network's activities. The collaboration with official intelligence agencies revealed both the network's value and the limitations of government-sanctioned operations in addressing humanitarian crises. The CIA's counterintelligence experts provided crucial assistance in identifying and neutralizing Kozlov's operatives, but their legal restrictions prevented them from taking direct action against his business operations or providing the kind of immediate assistance that network operatives could offer to threatened individuals. The partnership demonstrated how unofficial networks could complement official intelligence work while maintaining the flexibility needed for rapid humanitarian response. Rebecca's personal transformation during this period was as dramatic as the network's organizational evolution. Her military training had prepared her for leadership under pressure, but managing international intelligence operations required diplomatic skills and cultural understanding that she developed through intensive study and mentorship from experienced operatives. She learned to speak fluent Spanish and functional Arabic, studied international law and human rights protocols, and developed relationships with officials in multiple governments who could provide unofficial support for network activities. Impact on Sophie had been equally significant. though carefully managed to protect her from the more dangerous aspects of her mother's work. The 8-year-old had adapted to life in the manor with remarkable resilience, treating the constant presence of researchers and visitors as an extended adventure, while remaining unaware of the sensitive operations taking place in the building's secure areas. Her education now included languages, history, and cultural studies that would prepare her for eventual participation in family traditions, though Rebecca was determined to ensure that Sophie would have genuine choices about her future involvement. In intelligence work, the relationship between Rebecca and the Millbrook community had stabilized into something approaching normal, though residents remained aware that their quiet town had become the center of international attention that extended far beyond historical research. Mayor Bobby Carlile had learned to manage the media interest and tourism revenue while protecting the privacy and security that longtime residents valued. The economic benefits were substantial, with new businesses opening to serve the influx of researchers and visitors. But the community had also developed an unspoken understanding about respecting the Martinez family's privacy and security requirements. Dr. Whitmer's role in the community had been permanently altered by her failed attempt to expose Elena as a security threat, though she had eventually found redemption through her contributions to authenticating and interpreting Isabella's historical documents. Her expertise in Civil War history had proved invaluable to researchers studying the intelligence network, and her meticulous documentation methods had helped establish scholarly standards for analyzing materials that existed nowhere else. The Historical Society had become a respected research institution under her leadership, though she remained aware that her initial misunderstanding of Elena's activities had nearly destroyed both the network's security and the community's access to extraordinary historical resources. Harold Prescott's transition from unofficial security consultant to the network's director of counterintelligence had surprised even Rebecca, who had not initially understood the depth of his commitment to Elena's humanitarian mission. His FBI background provided crucial expertise in detecting and neutralizing threats to network operations, while his understanding of government bureaucracy helped navigate the complex regulatory environment that surrounded their activities. His marriage to a local teacher had given him deep roots in the Millbrook community, creating personal stakes in protecting both the network's operations and the town's security. The academic recognition of Isabella's intelligence network had exceeded even Dr. Chun's optimistic projections, with scholarly publications and museum exhibitions bringing international attention to the sophisticated nature of Civil War espionage operations. The discovery had led to reassessment of women's roles in 19th-century intelligence work and recognition of the ethnic diversity that had characterized both Union and Confederate spy networks. Isabella's story had been incorporated into high school and college curricula, inspiring a new generation of students to consider careers in intelligence and humanitarian work. But the historical recognition also created ongoing security challenges as foreign intelligence services used academic conferences and research collaborations to gather information about the network's contemporary operations. Rebecca had learned to distinguish between legitimate researchers and operatives working under scholarly cover, developing security protocols that protected sensitive information while allowing genuine academic work to continue. The balance required constant vigilance and sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities that had become essential elements of the network's operational security. The network's humanitarian achievements during Rebecca's first year of leadership demonstrated both the continuing relevance of Isabella's original mission and the effectiveness of combining historical traditions with modern capabilities. Operations coordinated from the Thornfield Manor had facilitated the evacuation of human rights activists from authoritarian regimes, provided early warning systems that prevented ethnic violence in several African countries, and assisted hundreds of refugees in reaching safety despite increasingly restrictive immigration policies in developed nations. The most significant success involved a complex operation in Syria that required coordination between network operatives, UN refugee officials, and covert support from multiple government agencies. Rebecca had personally managed the evacuation of a group of civil society leaders whose documentation of war crimes had made them targets for assassination by both government forces and extremist groups. The operation's success had saved 12 lives, while preserving evidence that would eventually be used in international criminal proceedings, demonstrating how the network's capabilities could serve both humanitarian and justice objectives. Success had also brought increased attention from hostile forces that viewed the network as a threat to their interests. Rebecca's intelligence briefings now included threat assessments from multiple agencies, warning about planned attacks on network facilities, attempts to kidnap key operatives, and sophisticated disinformation campaigns designed to discredit the organization's humanitarian mission. The security measures protecting the Thornfield Manor had evolved to include electronic surveillance systems, armed guards, and emergency protocols that could be activated if the facility came under direct attack. The financial aspects of network operations had become increasingly complex as the organization's growth attracted regulatory attention from banking authorities and tax agencies in multiple countries. Rebecca worked with legal experts who specialized in nonprofit law and international finance to ensure that the network's activities complied with applicable regulations while maintaining the operational flexibility needed for emergency humanitarian response. The legal framework supporting network operations now included formal partnerships with established humanitarian organizations, government contractors authorized to work in sensitive areas, and academic institutions that provided legitimate cover. For research and operational activities, the personal cost of leadership had been higher than Rebecca had anticipated, requiring sacrifices that affected every aspect of her life outside the network's mission. Romantic relationships were complicated by security requirements that made normal social interactions impossible, while friendships outside the network were limited by the need to maintain operational security about her activities. The isolation was reminiscent of Elena's experience during her decades of leadership, though Rebecca had access to support systems and professional counseling that had not been available to previous generations of network leaders. Sophie's welfare remained Rebecca's primary personal concern, requiring careful balance between providing her daughter with normal childhood experiences and preparing her for the realities of growing up in a family devoted to intelligence and humanitarian work. The 8-year-old had begun showing signs of the observational skills and emotional intelligence that had characterized previous generations of the Martinez family. But Rebecca was determined to ensure that Sophie's choices about her future would be based on genuine understanding rather than inherited obligation. The network's evolution under Rebecca's leadership had created opportunities for expanding its humanitarian mission into new areas that reflected contemporary global challenges. Climate change was creating new categories of displaced populations that existing refugee assistance programs could not adequately address, while technological surveillance capabilities were making it easier for authoritarian governments to identify and persecute political dissidents. The network's traditional strengths in providing clandestine assistance and creating alternative identity documents had proved adaptable to these emerging challenges. The relationship between the network and official government agencies had stabilized into a partnership that served both organizations' interests while maintaining the independence that made the network effective in situations where official involvement was impossible. Rebecca met monthly with liaison officers from the CIA, FBI, and State Department who coordinated information sharing and provided unofficial guidance about situations where network intervention might complement official diplomatic efforts. The arrangement provided government officials with plausible deniability, while giving the network access to intelligence and resources that enhanced its operational effectiveness. The transformation of the Thornfield Manor from Elena's private residence into the headquarters of an international humanitarian intelligence network represented the culmination of changes that had begun with Isabella's Civil War operations and continued through 5 generations of family leadership. The manor's hidden chambers now housed sophisticated communication equipment that connected Rebecca to operatives around the world, while its public spaces hosted the academic conferences and cultural events that provided operational cover for the network's more sensitive activities. Standing in Isabella's former command center, now equipped with technology that would have seemed miraculous to her Civil War-era ancestors, Rebecca understood that her family's legacy would continue evolving to meet the challenges of an increasingly complex and dangerous world. The humanitarian principles that had motivated Isabella's original intelligence work remained relevant to contemporary global challenges, while the operational methods and organizational structures had adapted to take advantage of modern capabilities and resources. The network that Elena had maintained through careful secrecy and limited resources had become an international organization that combined the effectiveness of professional intelligence operations with the moral clarity of humanitarian mission. Rebecca's leadership had transformed her family's historical legacy into a contemporary force for protecting vulnerable populations and promoting human rights in situations where official agencies could not or would not provide adequate assistance. Most unexpected challenge to Rebecca's leadership came not from foreign intelligence services or hostile governments, but from a source much closer to home. Sophie Martinez, now 9 years old, had been quietly developing her own understanding of her family's legacy and her potential role in continuing their humanitarian mission. What Rebecca discovered one autumn morning would fundamentally change her perspective on the network's future and the nature of inherited responsibility. Sophie had been spending increasingly long periods in the manor's library, ostensibly working on school assignments, but actually studying documents that Rebecca thought were safely secured. The child's natural curiosity and remarkable observational skills had led her to decode several of Elena's filing systems, giving her access to information about current network operations that even some adult operatives didn't possess. Rebecca found Sophie's notebook filled with detailed maps showing refugee routes, coded messages that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of operational security, and analysis of political situations in countries where the network was active. "Mommy," Sophie said when confronted about her unauthorized research, "I know you think I'm too young to understand, but Bisabula Elena was teaching me things before she died. She said our family has always protected people who can't protect themselves, and that someday it would be my responsibility too." The conversation that followed revealed that Elena had been preparing Sophie for her eventual role in the network. Since she was old enough to understand stories, using fairy tales and family history to plant seeds that were now growing into genuine commitment to humanitarian principles, the revelation forced Rebecca to confront questions about choice, tradition, and the ethics of involving children in intelligence work that she had been avoiding since assuming network leadership. Elena's approach to preparing Sophie had been subtle but systematic, designed to develop the skills and worldview that would make her effective in intelligence work while maintaining plausible deniability about the family's activities. But Sophie's independent research had accelerated the timeline for these conversations, creating a situation where Rebecca could no longer protect her daughter from understanding the full scope of their family's mission. The crisis deepened when Sophie's research uncovered information about a network operation in progress that adults had missed. Her analysis of political developments in Myanmar had identified threats to a group of democracy activists that the network's adult operatives had not recognized. Sophie's warning, initially dismissed as the imagination of a precocious child, proved accurate when government forces raided safe houses just hours after the activists had been evacuated, based on her intelligence assessment. The incident demonstrated that Sophie possessed analytical capabilities that were genuinely valuable to network operations, not just the enthusiasm of a child playing at adult activities. The ethical dilemma was unprecedented in Network's history. Isabella's children had been involved in intelligence work during the Civil War, but 19th century childhood was different from contemporary expectations about protecting minors from adult responsibilities. Elena had prepared Rebecca for network leadership over decades, but always with the understanding that participation would be voluntary and based on adult decision-making. Sophie's precocious involvement challenged assumptions about age-appropriate participation while demonstrating capabilities that could save lives if properly utilized. Professor Whitfield convened an emergency meeting of the network's senior leadership to address the situation, bringing together operatives and advisors from around the world to discuss precedents and protocols for involving minors in intelligence work. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about childhood, duty, and the nature of inherited responsibility that reflected broader tensions between traditional espionage, culture, and contemporary humanitarian values. Some participants argued that Sophie's natural abilities and family heritage justified involving her in network operations, while others insisted that protecting her childhood was more important than utilizing her analytical skills. The resolution came from an unexpected source that demonstrated the network's evolution under Rebecca's leadership. Dr. Chun, whose historical research had initially exposed Isabella's intelligence network, proposed a compromise that would honor both Sophie's capabilities and contemporary child protection principles. Sophie would be enrolled in specialized educational programs that would develop her analytical and language skills, while providing age-appropriate involvement in humanitarian projects that served the network's mission without exposing her to operational dangers. The proposal led to the creation of a junior program that would prepare children of network families for eventual participation, while ensuring they had genuine choices about their futures. Sophie became the program's first participant, working with mentors who helped her develop research skills, cultural understanding, and ethical frameworks that would serve her whether she chose to continue family traditions or pursue other careers. The program attracted support from educators and child development experts, who recognized the value of providing gifted children with challenging intellectual opportunities while protecting their emotional and social development. But Sophie's involvement also created new security vulnerabilities that required innovative solutions. Her research activities had attracted attention from hostile intelligence services that were monitoring the network's communications and personnel. Rebecca discovered that several foreign agencies had identified Sophie as a potential source of information about network operations, either through recruitment or kidnapping, that would provide leverage over Rebecca's decision-making. The threats forced the implementation of unprecedented security measures to protect a child whose intellectual capabilities made her both an asset and a target. The security challenges were complicated by Sophie's own growing awareness of her importance to both the network and its enemies. Her understanding of operational security was sophisticated enough to recognize when she was being watched, and her analytical skills allowed her to identify potential threats that adult security personnel sometimes missed. But her emotional development was still that of a 9-year-old child, creating situations where her intellectual capabilities exceeded her psychological readiness to handle the stress and responsibility of intelligence work. The transformation of the Thornfield Manor to accommodate Sophie's dual role as a protected child and a junior network participant required extensive modifications that balanced security requirements with family life. New educational facilities were constructed in the manor's secure areas, while enhanced protection systems ensured that Sophie could pursue normal childhood activities without compromising operational security. The arrangements attracted attention from child welfare authorities who had to be convinced that Sophie's unusual educational opportunities were in her best interests rather than exploitation of a minor. The network's humanitarian mission continued. expanding under Rebecca's leadership, with operations that demonstrated the continuing relevance of intelligence capabilities for protecting vulnerable populations. A particularly successful intervention involved preventing ethnic violence in a region of Africa, where early warning systems developed by network analysts had identified preparations for coordinated attacks on minority communities. The operation's success saved hundreds of lives while demonstrating how modern intelligence capabilities could be used to prevent humanitarian disasters rather than simply responding to them after they occurred. But the network's growth also attracted increased attention from government agencies that were reassessing their relationships with unofficial intelligence organizations. Congressional hearings on intelligence oversight had begun examining the network's activities, with some legislators arguing that such operations should be brought under direct government control, while others defended the value of maintaining independent humanitarian capabilities. Rebecca found herself testifying before classified sessions of congressional committees, defending the network's autonomy while demonstrating its value to American foreign policy objectives. The political pressure created new categories of stress for Rebecca, who had to balance the network's operational requirements with the demands of congressional oversight and media attention. Her military background had prepared her for dealing with government bureaucracy, but the combination of intelligence work, humanitarian mission, and public scrutiny required skills that she was still developing. The support systems that Elena had created for managing these pressures had been designed for a different era, when the network's existence was completely secret rather than partially acknowledged by government officials and academic researchers. Sophie's perspective on these challenges provided insights that adult participants sometimes missed, demonstrating how her unique position as both insider and child gave her access to understanding that was valuable for network operations. Her analysis of media coverage identified patterns in hostile disinformation campaigns that adult analysts had not recognized, while her observations about the behavior of government officials provided early warnings about policy changes that could affect network operations. The recognition that a 9-year-old could contribute meaningfully to counterintelligence analysis challenged assumptions about age and capability that had limited the network's effectiveness. The annual conference commemorating Isabella's intelligence network had become a major academic event that attracted researchers from around the world, while providing cover for network operational meetings. Rebecca's opening address to the conference reflected on the evolution of her family's humanitarian mission and the challenges of adapting 19th-century principles to contemporary global realities. Her speech emphasized the continuing relevance of intelligence capabilities for protecting vulnerable populations, while acknowledging the ethical complexities of operating outside official government channels. But the conference also served as the venue for revealing information that would reshape understanding of the network's historical significance and contemporary mission. Rebecca announced the discovery of additional documents that proved Isabella's network had been larger and more influential than previously realized, with operations that had extended into Mexico, Canada, and several European countries during the Civil War period. The revelation suggested that intelligence networks operating across national boundaries had been more common in the 19th century than historians had recognized, providing historical precedent for contemporary international humanitarian operations. The most significant announcement involved the establishment of an Isabella Vasquez Foundation that would provide public recognition and support for the network's humanitarian mission while maintaining operational security for sensitive activities. The foundation would fund refugee assistance programs, support research on conflict prevention, and provide scholarships for students interested in careers combining intelligence analysis with humanitarian work. The public face of the foundation would allow the network to operate more openly while protecting the clandestine capabilities that made it effective in crisis situations. Sophie's role in the Foundation's establishment demonstrated her growing importance to the network's future while respecting her status as a minor who needed protection from adult responsibilities. She would serve as a junior board member, participating in discussions about the Foundation's educational programs while remaining insulated from operational decisions that could put her at risk. The arrangement provided her with meaningful involvement in the family mission while ensuring that her choices about future participation would be based on adult understanding rather than childhood obligation. The ceremony establishing the Isabella Vasquez Foundation took place in the Thornfield Manor's restored ballroom, with participants who included government officials, academic researchers, humanitarian workers, and network operatives from around the world. The event marked the transformation of Elena's carefully guarded secrets into a publicly acknowledged legacy that could inspire future generations, while continuing to protect vulnerable populations through both overt and covert means. Rebecca's concluding remarks at the ceremony reflected on the journey that had brought her family from Isabella's Civil War intelligence work to contemporary international humanitarian operations. She acknowledged the sacrifices made by previous generations, while expressing hope that future network leaders would have better support systems and clearer legal frameworks for their activities. Her words emphasized that the network's strength came not from secrecy, but from its commitment to protecting people who had no other protection, a mission that remained relevant regardless of changes in political circumstances or technological capabilities. The audience's response to Rebecca's speech demonstrated the broad support that existed for the network's humanitarian mission, but also the recognition that such work required people willing to accept extraordinary personal risks for the benefit of others. The applause was respectful rather than enthusiastic, acknowledging the serious nature of intelligence work and the ongoing dangers faced by network participants. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for Elena Martinez and other network members who had died in service of humanitarian principles, a reminder that the work continued to exact personal costs despite its public recognition. As guests departed from the manor that evening, Rebecca and Sophie stood together in Isabella's former command center, now equipped with modern technology but still serving its original purpose of coordinating intelligence operations that protected vulnerable populations. The child's questions about her future role in the network reflected both her understanding of family traditions and her growing awareness of the choices she would need to make as she matured. Rebecca's answers emphasized that those choices would be hers to make, but that the family's legacy would continue regardless of Sophie's individual decisions about participation. The story of the single mother who inherited a creepy mansion and discovered her family's extraordinary legacy had evolved into something that transcended individual biography to become a testament to the power of principled people working together across generations to protect human dignity and promote justice in an often hostile world. The network that Isabella had created during the Civil War and Elena had maintained through decades of careful secrecy had become a model for how intelligence capabilities could serve humanitarian purposes while adapting to changing global circumstances, standing in the manner that had served as headquarters for 5 generations of intelligence operations. Rebecca understood that her family story would continue long after her own leadership ended. The humanitarian principles that had motivated Isabella's original network remained relevant to contemporary challenges, while the operational methods and organizational structures would continue evolving to meet new threats and opportunities. The legacy that Elena had entrusted to her care had grown beyond family tradition to become something that belonged to everyone who shared its commitment to protecting the vulnerable and promoting human rights. The transformation of the Thornfield Manor from a mysterious inheritance into the center of international humanitarian intelligence operations demonstrated how individual courage and family traditions could evolve to address the great challenges of their time. Rebecca's journey from struggling single mother to network Leader had required sacrifices and adaptations that changed every aspect of her life, but it had also provided opportunities to serve causes greater than personal comfort or conventional success. If you've ever discovered something extraordinary hidden in your family's past, or if you've witnessed how individual courage can grow into something that changes the world, we'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Have you ever found evidence of ancestors who lived more adventurous lives than you realized? Or have you discovered that your family traditions had deeper meanings than apparent on the surface? Share your thoughts about hidden legacies and inherited responsibilities, and let us know if you think some secrets are worth keeping, even when they could bring recognition or fame. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about extraordinary people whose lives were more complex and significant than anyone realized. Hit the notification bell to be the first to know when we reveal new discoveries about families whose quiet service changed history. And like this video if you believe that some of the most important work in the world is done by people whose names will never be widely known. Sometimes the most powerful legacies are the ones that continue growing long after their creators are gone, inspiring new generations to serve causes greater than themselves while protecting the vulnerable and promoting justice in a world that desperately needs both courage and compassion.